At 47 seconds past 3 in the morning, on the 9th of August, 1945, a 4-engine bomber lifted off from a coral airstrip on the Pacific island of Tinian. The aircraft was a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, serial number 44,27297. Its name was Bockscar. In its bomb bay was a 5-ton plutonium implosion weapon called Fat Man, already armed by a Navy officer who had climbed down into the darkened bomb bay 30 minutes after takeoff and pulled the green safety plugs out and screwed the red firing plugs in. The pilot was a 25-year-old major from Lowell, Massachusetts, named Charles Sweeney. His target that morning was not the city that would receive the bomb. Between 3:47 in the morning and 11:02 the same morning, 9 separate mistakes and coincidences and small failures of weather and machinery and human judgment would combine, one after another, to divert this aircraft from its intended target and to place the second atomic weapon ever used in war over a small industrial valley on the northern edge of Nagasaki. In that valley lived 12,000 baptized Catholics. They were the descendants of the hidden Christians of Japan, who had survived 250 years of persecution by the Tokugawa shogunate to keep their faith alive. 8,500 of them would die that morning. This is the story of the 9 mistakes, and of the city that paid for them. If your father or your grandfather served in the Pacific in the Second World War, this is a story about the war they finished. Settle in with a warm drink, and let us begin. The story you are about to hear is drawn from the official mission reports of the 509th Composite Group of the United States Army Air Forces, from the post-war memoirs of Major Charles Sweeney, and other members of the Bockscar crew, from the survivor testimonies collected by the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum, from Dr. Takashi Nagai's memoir, The Bells of Nagasaki, and from the histories of the Kokura Kirishiten, the hidden Christians of Nagasaki, compiled over the past century by Catholic scholars and by the Archdiocese of Nagasaki. Every date is verifiable. Every name is real. Every decision that led the bomb to fall where it fell is a matter of record. The pilot's name was Charles William Sweeney. He was 25 years old on the morning of August 9th, 1945. He had been born on the 27th of December, 1919, in the city of Lowell, Massachusetts, a mill town on the Merrimack River, an hour north of Boston. He was the son of Irish immigrants, raised Catholic, one of 5 children. His father had worked in the textile mills, and Charles, called Chuck by his family, had grown up expecting to do something similar. For the rest of his life, he did not do something similar. At the age of 16, at North Quincy High School just outside of Boston, Chuck Sweeney climbed into the passenger seat of a small biplane at a local airfield and took a 15-minute joyride over the coast of Massachusetts. He came down from that flight with the fixed intention of becoming a military pilot. He would never afterwards seriously consider any other profession. He enrolled at Boston University for a year. He transferred briefly to Purdue University in Indiana. He did not graduate. On the 28th of April, 1941, 7 months before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the United States Army Air Corps as an aviation cadet. He would spend the next 4 years of his life doing exactly what he had wanted to do since he was 16. He would fly airplanes for the United States military. By late 1944, at the age of 25, Sweeney had risen to the rank of major and had been selected by Colonel Paul Warfield Tibbets, Jr., 30 years old, to be part of a highly classified new unit called the 509th Composite Group. The 509th was being trained at Wendover Army Airfield, a remote base on the Utah-Nevada line, for a mission that its members were not told the full nature of. They were being trained to deliver atomic weapons. Nobody at Wendover was allowed to say the word. They practiced dropping large single bombs, painted orange and called pumpkins, from very high altitudes, and they practiced flying the aircraft on which the bombs would eventually be carried. The aircraft was a modified version of the standard American B-29 Superfortress heavy bomber, stripped of most of its defensive armor and armament, and fitted with a specially reinforced bomb bay. There were 46 of these modified aircraft eventually built, all under the code name Silverplate. Each had a name. The one Sweeney would fly to Nagasaki was named Bockscar, after its usual pilot, Captain Frederick Bock. The one that had flown to Hiroshima 3 days earlier was named Enola Gay, after Tibbetts' mother. On the 6th of August, 1945, Sweeney had piloted the instrumentation and observation aircraft, the Great Artisti, alongside the Enola Gay on the mission that destroyed the city of Hiroshima. Sweeney had watched the mushroom cloud rise over the western Honshu coast from 20,000 feet away. He had returned to Tinian that afternoon and had gone to bed still not fully understanding. He wrote later what he had just seen. 3 nights later, on the evening of the 8th of August, Colonel Tibbetts called him into a briefing room at the 509th Group headquarters and told him he would command the second atomic mission. The target was Kokura, an industrial city in northern Kyushu that contained one of the largest Japanese army arsenals in the empire. The secondary target, in case Kokura was obscured by weather, was a shipbuilding and port city further south, called Nagasaki. The mission was originally scheduled for the 11th of August. The extended weather forecast for the Japanese home islands showed an approaching front that would put the entire region under cloud cover for 5 to 7 days, beginning on the 10th. Tibbetts and General Curtis LeMay, the chief of the Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific, decided to move the mission up by 2 days. Fat Man was hastily assembled through the night of August 8th to 9th by the Manhattan Project weaponeers on Tinian. The implosion bomb was a complicated device, with a plutonium pit at its center, surrounded by 32-shaped explosive lenses that had to be detonated simultaneously with millisecond precision in order for the plutonium core to be compressed to critical mass. It was heavier and larger and more sophisticated than the uranium gun-type bomb that had been used at Hiroshima. It also had a substantially greater yield. Fat Man would release energy equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT, roughly 40% more powerful than Little Boy had been. At the pre-mission briefing on the evening of the 8th, Tibbetts gave Sweeney a specific and warning. Sweeney was to rendezvous over a small volcanic island south of Kyushu called Yakushima, with 2 other aircraft, the Great Artisti, which would carry blast measurement instrumentation, and Big Stink, which would carry photographic equipment. Because of a developing typhoon around Iwo Jima, the normal rendezvous point used on the Hiroshima mission was not available. The Yakushima rendezvous would have to be conducted at 30,000 feet altitude, more than 3 times the altitude of the Hiroshima rendezvous, and would therefore consume substantially more fuel than the earlier mission had planned for. Tibbetts, in his final words to Sweeney that night, said the following, and Sweeney would remember those words and quote them in his memoirs for the rest of his life. Tibbetts said, 15 minutes maximum at rendezvous. Charles, do not wait for the 3rd aircraft. 15 minutes and you go. Sweeney said he understood. He went to bed a few hours later and got, by his own account, about 90 minutes of sleep before the wake-up call. At 2 in the morning on the 9th of August, he sat down in the mess tent with the rest of his crew for the pre-flight meal. There were 12 men in the Bockscar crew that morning. Sweeney, the pilot, at the aircraft commander's station on the left seat. Captain Charles Albury, 24 years old, the co-pilot. Captain James Van Pelt, the navigator. Captain Kermit Beahan, the bombardier, from Joplin, Missouri, 27 years old, that very morning because the 9th of August was his birthday. Master Sergeant John Kuharek, the flight engineer. Staff Sergeant Ray Gallagher, the assistant flight engineer. Staff Sergeant Ed Buckley, the radar operator. Sergeant Abe Spitzer, the radio operator. Staff Sergeant Albert Dehart, the tail gunner, and 3 additional men who were not part of the regular crew, but were flying as mission specialists. Commander Frederick L. Ashworth, 33 years old, of the United States Navy, the weaponeer, who had authority over the atomic weapon itself. Lieutenant Philip Barnes, the assistant weaponeer, and Second Lieutenant Fred O'Leary, an additional co-pilot flying observer. Kermit Beahan sat down at the table that morning to a small stack of pancakes and a mug of coffee. Someone in the crew, probably Sweeney, said, "Happy birthday, B." Beahan smiled and thanked them. He did not particularly want a birthday party at 2 in the morning on Tinian in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But he ate his pancakes. He would drop the bomb in 9 hours. There is one detail about Kermit Beahan that has to be understood before we go further, because it explains a great deal about the man who put his eye to the Norden bombsite over Nagasaki at 11 o'clock that morning and made the decision that placed the second atomic weapon in human history over the largest Christian community in Asia. Kermit King Beahan had been born on the 9th of August, 1918, in Joplin, Missouri, a small mining town in the southwest corner of the state. He had gone to Rice Institute, later Rice University, in Houston, Texas, on a football scholarship in the middle 1930s. He had enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1940 as an aviation cadet, had washed out of pilot training, and had been reclassified as a bombardier. By the time the United States entered the Second World War in December of 1941, Beahan was serving as a bombardier instructor at a training base in Louisiana. Then the war took him. He was assigned to the 97th Bombardment Group, one of the first American heavy bomber units to reach England, and he flew 13 combat missions over occupied Europe as a bombardier on Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses. He was then reassigned to the 15th Air Force in North Africa and flew another 17 missions over Italy and southern Europe. Over the course of those 30 combat missions, Beahan was shot down 4 separate times. Twice he crash-landed in friendly territory. Twice he bailed out. Once he spent 3 days evading capture behind German lines in Sicily before he was recovered. He had, in the words of the crew who flew with him, more lives than a cat. By the time he was selected for the 509th Composite Group in the fall of 1944, Kermit Beahan had a reputation in the American heavy bomber community as the best precision bombardier in the United States Army Air Forces. The reputation had a phrase attached to it. The other crews said Beahan could hit a pickle barrel with a bomb from 30,000 feet. Sweeney's crew called him by 2 nicknames: the Great Artiste, which was the name eventually painted on the aircraft because of his skill with the bomb sight, and Honeybee, or just B, because, as Sweeney later put it, he was so likable we couldn't stand to call him by anything formal. He was, by every account that has survived, a genuinely good man. Modest, funny, a talented amateur musician who played the trombone, loved by everyone who flew with him. He would carry, for the next 44 years of his life until his death of a heart attack in the Clear Lake suburb of Houston on the 9th of March, 1989, the knowledge that on his 27th birthday, he had released the bomb that killed 40,000 human beings and injured tens of thousands more, and that he had spotted the target through a hole in the clouds at the last possible second, and that if the hole had not been there, the bomb would have gone into the sea and Nagasaki would have lived. He would say, in a rare public interview on the 40th anniversary of the bombing in 1985, that it was the best way out of a hell of a mess. He would also say, more than once, that he hoped he would remain forever the last man to have dropped an atomic bomb on another human being. That was the man at the bomb site. Now we have to describe 2 more men, because they matter to what happens over Kokura and what happens over Nagasaki. The first is Commander Frederick L. Ashworth, the weaponeer. Ashworth was 33 years old on the morning of August 9, 1945. He was a United States Navy officer, a graduate of the Naval Academy at Annapolis in the class of 1933, who had spent most of the interwar decade as a specialist in Navy ordnance and gunnery. In late 1944, he had been assigned to the Manhattan Project as one of the small group of technical officers who would arm the atomic weapons in flight and who would have final authority over the deployment of the weapon on target. Ashworth's authority on the Nagasaki mission was, in the specific language of the mission orders, superior to Sweeney's on all matters relating to the bomb. Sweeney flew the plane. Ashworth decided when and how and, if necessary, whether the bomb would be released. If Sweeney and Ashworth disagreed on any bomb-related matter, Ashworth's decision would prevail. This was not a comfortable arrangement between a 25-year-old Army Air Forces major and a 33-year-old Navy commander. But it was the arrangement the Manhattan Project had established, and both men understood it. Ashworth would spend most of the next 40 years of his career in the American nuclear weapons program. He would rise to Vice Admiral in the United States Navy before his retirement in 1968. He would die on the 3rd of December, 2005, at the age of 93, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, honored throughout the Navy as one of the founding officers of the American nuclear submarine program that he had helped Admiral Hyman Rickover build in the 1950s. He never publicly regretted his role in the Nagasaki mission. He also, according to his family, never spoke about it at home. The second man we have to describe is not on the Bockscar. He is on a separate aircraft called Big Stink that will make one of the 9 mistakes of the morning. His name is Major James Hopkins, Jr. He is 29 years old. He is the operations officer of the 509th Composite Group, senior to Sweeney in the group hierarchy, though not in operational command of the mission. He is a highly experienced pilot who has flown in the Pacific for over a year. On the morning of the 9th of August, he is at the controls of the 3rd aircraft in the mission formation, the camera plane called Big Stink, whose sole purpose is to photograph the atomic detonation for scientific documentation. Big Stink is carrying, in its cabin, one of the most important men on the entire Manhattan Project, Robert Serber, 36 years old, a physicist from the University of California at Berkeley, who had been one of the original scientists at Los Alamos, working directly under J. Robert Oppenheimer, and who had personally supervised the design of the plutonium implosion mechanism that was, at that very moment, sitting in Bockscar's bomb bay. Serber was on Big Stink to operate the specialized high-speed camera equipment that would document the atomic blast from a safe distance. He was, in fact, the only person on Big Stink who knew how to operate the equipment. He was not going to make it to the target. At the end of the pre-flight checks, as the crew of Big Stink was preparing to close the hatches for taxi and takeoff, Major Hopkins conducted a routine parachute count. There were supposed to be 12 parachutes on the aircraft, one for each crew member and passenger. There were 11. Somewhere in the pre-flight loading, the supply sergeant had failed to put a 12th parachute on board. Hopkins looked around the cabin. He counted the men. He counted the parachutes again. He announced, per standard Army Air Forces procedure, that one man was going to have to get off the aircraft. The man who got off was Robert Serber, because Serber was the passenger with the lowest formal military standing, not being an officer at all, but a civilian consultant to the mission. Serber later described the scene in his 1998 memoir Peace and War, in one of the most darkly funny passages ever written about the atomic bomb project. He wrote, "I didn't know the drill, and the supply sergeant had probably neglected to give me one when he gave me a lot of other junk. The pilot ordered me put off the plane. That was truly idiotic. He forgot that he wasn't on a joyride. The plane was supposed to have a mission." The mission was to take pictures, and I was the only one aboard who knew how to run the camera. Serber climbed off Big Stink at approximately 3:30 in the morning of August 9th, 1945. He watched from the tarmac at Tinian as the aircraft taxied for takeoff without him. He then walked back to his quarters and lay awake in his tent for the next 12 hours, listening for the radio reports, wondering what was happening 6,000 miles away over the Japanese home islands. The photographs of the Nagasaki mushroom cloud that appear in every American history textbook of the Second World War were as a result of a supply sergeant's oversight and Major Hopkins' rigid adherence to safety procedure, taken not by Robert Serber, but by an Army photographer named Sergeant Charles Levy from the observation aircraft, the Great Artisti. The pictures survived. They were good pictures. Levy did his job, but that was only the first mistake of the morning. There would be 8 more. Bockscar rolled down the runway at Tinian at 3:47 in the morning of August 9th, 1945. It carried a 5-ton plutonium implosion bomb, 12 men, and enough fuel to fly to Japan, complete its mission, and return to Iwo Jima with a 2-hour reserve. The fuel was already a problem before takeoff. 90 minutes before Bockscar's engine started, the flight engineer, Master Sergeant John Kuharek, had discovered during his final pre-flight inspection that the fuel transfer pump connecting the rear reserve tank to the main fuel system was inoperative. This meant that 625 gallons of fuel loaded into the rear reserve tank was, for practical purposes, unusable. Bockscar could not access those 625 gallons in flight. Kuharek reported the problem to Sweeney. Sweeney faced a decision. He could abort the mission and offload the bomb, which would delay the second atomic strike by at least 24 hours and possibly longer. He could switch to a backup aircraft, which would require transferring the bomb between airframes, an extremely dangerous operation that had never been attempted with a live atomic weapon. Or he could proceed with the mission on reduced usable fuel. Sweeney called Tibbets. Tibbets left the decision to Sweeney but reminded him again of the Yakushima rendezvous discipline. 15 minutes maximum. You have less fuel than you think. Don't waste it. Sweeney elected to proceed. The 3 aircraft of the Nagasaki mission, Bockscar, the Great Artiste under Captain Frederick Bock, and Big Stink under Major James Hopkins were airborne within 30 minutes of one another, climbing north-northwest toward the Japanese home islands. Bockscar reached the assigned Yakushima rendezvous point at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning of the 9th. The Great Artisti was there, circling at 30,000 feet. Big Stink was not. Sweeney and Bock circled at 30,000 feet for the next 30 to 40 minutes, well past Tibbets' 15-minute limit, waiting for Hopkins to arrive. There is some dispute in the historical record about exactly how long they waited and about who authorized the extended wait. Sweeney's own memoir suggests it was Ashworth, exercising his weaponeer authority, who insisted on waiting for the camera plane to arrive so that the scientific documentation of the atomic blast would not be compromised. Ashworth, in later interviews, said the decision was Sweeney's. What is not disputed is that they waited well past the 15-minute limit, that they burned additional fuel at 30,000 feet doing so, and that Big Stink never appeared. Major Hopkins, later reconstruction of Big Stink's flight path established, had misunderstood the rendezvous altitude briefing. He had climbed his aircraft not to 30,000 feet, but to 39,000 feet. He had spent the same 40 minutes circling Yakushima 9,000 feet above Bockscar and the Great Artist. He had never seen them. They had never seen him. Big Stink eventually turned north and continued alone toward the target area, hoping to arrive over Kokura in time to observe the drop. At approximately 9:40 in the morning, having waited over 30 minutes for a rendezvous that would never occur, Bockscar and the Great Artiste turned north from Yakushima and proceeded to the primary target. Bockscar was now approximately 45 minutes behind schedule. It had already burned substantial extra fuel at the high-altitude rendezvous. 625 gallons of its reserve fuel were mechanically inaccessible. The weather over the target area was reported by Enola Gay, which was flying the weather reconnaissance for Kokura, as 3/10 cloud cover with improving conditions. But the world was not as Enola Gay had reported it. To understand what happened next, we have to leave the aircraft for a moment and look down at the ground beneath them. We have to understand the two cities on the northern coast of Kyushu that were about to determine between them whose morning would end in fire. We have to understand Kokura, and we have to understand Nagasaki. The city of Kokura sat on the northern coast of the Japanese island of Kyushu, at the very tip of the archipelago closest to the Asian mainland, on a plain of level industrial land, looking north across the Kanman Strait toward the main Japanese island of Honshu. In 1945, Kokura was one of the great arsenal cities of the Japanese Empire. Its population was approximately 178,000 people, spread across a landscape of foundries, machine shops, small metalworking factories, and, at the center of it all, the enormous Kokura Army Arsenal Complex, a walled installation of over 90 large industrial buildings that produced tanks, artillery pieces, shells, small arms ammunition, and heavy machine guns for the Imperial Japanese Army. The arsenal had been in continuous production since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. By 1945, it was one of the 2 or 3 largest ordnance production facilities in Japan. Kokura was the primary target of the Nagasaki mission for a specific reason. American strategic bombing planners, working through the 20th Air Force under General Curtis LeMay, had concluded that destruction of the Kokura arsenal would produce more immediate operational damage to the Japanese Army's capacity to continue the war than would the destruction of any other summer single military target on the home islands. Kokura also happened to sit 6 miles east of another major Japanese industrial installation. The Yawata Iron and Steel Works at Yawata was the largest steel production facility in Japan, and had been so since the Meiji Restoration of the late 19th century. Yawata's blast furnaces and coke ovens ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, throughout the war, producing the steel that armored the tanks assembled at Kokura, and the ships built at Nagasaki, and the aircraft manufactured at Nagoya. On the night of the 8th of August, 1945, 24 hours before Bockscar reached the Japanese home islands, the United States Army Air Forces had conducted a major incendiary bombing raid on Yawata. 221 B-29 Superfortresses of the 20th Air Force had dropped over 1,600 tons of incendiary bombs on the Yawata steel complex. The raid had continued through the early hours of the morning and had ignited fires that were still burning at dawn on the 9th. Fires produced a dense column of smoke and industrial haze that drifted northeast over the entire Kokura Arsenal region. There is a claim made in 2014 by a former Yawata steel plant worker named Satoru Miyashiro, then 85 years old, that the surviving Yawata workers on the morning of the 9th deliberately burned coal tar in the ruined coke ovens to produce additional black smoke over the region, in the hope of concealing whatever Japanese cities the Americans might next attempt to bomb. Miyashiro's claim has never been independently corroborated. It is one testimony among many, but whether Miyashiro's claim is fully accurate or is a partial memory of the confusion of that morning, what is not disputed is that by the time Bockscar arrived over Kokura at 10:44 in the morning, the entire city and its arsenal were obscured beneath a thick layer of smoke that had originated in the American firebombing raid of the previous night. Kokura, on the morning of the 9th of August, 1,000 945 was hidden from Bockscar's bomb site by the previous night's American bombs. That is a fact that historians of the atomic bomb do not often dwell on, but it belongs in the story. Kokura was saved, on the morning it was scheduled to die, by the same American bomber command that had scheduled its death. There is a moral geometry there that is worth pausing over. We will pause over it in a moment. Now let us describe the second city. Nagasaki was a very different place. It lay on the southwestern coast of Kyushu, 100 miles south of Kokura, on a deep and sheltered natural harbor between steep hills. It had been a port city for 600 years. Its population in 1945 was approximately 250,000, swollen with refugees from other bombed Japanese cities. It contained major shipbuilding facilities at the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries yards on the southern shore of the harbor, and a large ordnance factory called the Mitsubishi Urakami Ordnance Works at the northern edge of the city. But Nagasaki was also something else. Nagasaki was Japan's Christian city. The Christian story of Nagasaki began in the year 1549, when the Basque Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier landed at the southern Japanese port of Kagoshima with a small party of Portuguese sailors and merchants, and began preaching the Catholic faith among the Japanese peasantry. Within 30 years, Christianity had established itself throughout western Kyushu, and Nagasaki opened to Portuguese trade. In 1571, had become the largest Christian community in Asia. By the year 1587, when the warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi began the first serious crackdown on the Japanese Christian community, there were an estimated 300,000 baptized Catholics in Japan, of whom perhaps a third lived in Nagasaki and its immediate vicinity. Hideyoshi's crackdown escalated. In 1597, 26 Christians, including 6 European missionaries and 20 Japanese converts, were arrested at various places in the empire, marched to Nagasaki, and crucified on a hill outside the city called Nishizaka. The hill was chosen specifically because it faced the harbor, and the crucifixions would be visible to the Portuguese trading vessels that were then in port. The 26 martyrs of Nagasaki, as they became known, would be canonized by Pope Pius IX in 1862. The persecution intensified under the Tokugawa shogunate that came to power in 1603. In 1614, the shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu issued a total ban on Christianity in the empire. Foreign missionaries were expelled. Japanese converts were ordered to renounce their faith or face execution. In 1637, in the town of Shimabara, on the peninsula east of Nagasaki, the Christian peasantry rose in a great rebellion against the shogunate's tax collectors and religious inquisitors. The rebellion held out for 4 months in an abandoned fortress against the combined armies of the shogunate. When the fortress finally fell, in the spring of 1638, 37,000 Christian men, women, and children who had taken refuge inside were killed. After Shimabara, the Tokugawa shogunate concluded that Christianity had to be extirpated from Japan by any means necessary. For the next 250 years, from 1638 to 1873, being a Christian in Japan was a capital crime. The systematic apparatus of enforcement was terrifying and thorough. Every household in every village of Kyushu was required to register with a Buddhist temple and to receive an annual visit from the shogunate's inspectors. During the visit, every member of the household, including the children, was required to trample on a small metal or wooden plaque bearing an image of the Virgin Mary or of the crucifixion. The practice was called fumi-e, image trampling. Any household member who refused, or who hesitated, or who showed any sign of emotion during the trampling was arrested. Those who confessed the Christian faith were tortured to force them to name other members of the underground church, and were then executed by crucifixion, by beheading, or by being suspended head down in a pit of excrement, a practice called anasarushi that could take up to a week to kill the victim. Under this regime, the visible church of Nagasaki disappeared. Every priest was killed or expelled. Every catechist was killed. Every publicly identifiable Christian was killed. But the faith did not disappear. For 250 years, in the fishing villages and rice-farming hamlets north and east of Nagasaki, and on the small islands off the western coast of Kyushu, small networks of Japanese peasants continued, in absolute secrecy, to practice the Christian faith. They memorized the Latin prayers phonetically, without understanding them, passing the sounds from one generation to the next. They baptized their own children, using rainwater, collected in improvised vessels. They elected, from their own numbers, unofficial catechists, to preserve the calendar of the Christian year. They venerated small statues of the Virgin Mary that they hid inside statues of the Buddhist goddess of mercy, Kannon, so that if the shogunate's inspectors came to the house, they would see only a Buddhist shrine. They performed the Fumi-e ritual every January in front of the shogunate's inspectors, trampling the image of the Virgin Mary with tears in their eyes, and then went home and spent the rest of the day in prayer, asking for forgiveness for the sacrilege they had been forced to commit in order to survive. They called themselves the Kokura Kirishitan, the hidden Christians. 250 years, 10 generations, passed down in complete secrecy, at the constant risk of torture and execution, without a single ordained priest to celebrate the sacraments, without a single Bible, without a single church. 10 generations kept the faith alive. Then, in the year 1865, a young French missionary priest named Bernard Petit-Jean, who had been sent to the newly reopened port of Nagasaki as part of the Meiji-era diplomatic thaw, opened his small wooden church at Ora, on the south shores of Nagasaki Harbor, for public worship. It was the first Catholic church to operate legally in Japan in more than 2 centuries. On the 17th of March, 1865, a group of 15 Japanese men and women dressed in the peasant clothing of the Urakami district north of the city entered Ura Church. They approached Father Petit-Jean at the altar. An elderly woman among them spoke in a whisper. She said, "In Japanese, the hearts of all of us here are the same as yours." Father Petit-Jean did not understand. He asked her to repeat it. She did. Then a younger woman standing beside her said, in slightly clearer Japanese, "Where is the statue of Santa Maria?" Petit-Jean understood then. He led them to a side altar where a small statue of the Virgin Child stood. The 15 Japanese peasants prostrated themselves in front of the statue and began to weep. They told Petit-Jean over the next several hours, in whispered fragments of their peculiar, hereditary Japanese, that there were more of them, 10,000 more, living in the villages of the Urakami Valley just north of Nagasaki, all secretly Catholic, all descendants of the martyrs of 1597, and the peasants of Shimabara, all having kept the faith, without a priest, for 10 generations, all having waited for the priests to come back. Father Petit-Jean sent a letter to Paris that afternoon. The letter reached the Vatican 2 months later. Pope Pius IX wept when he read it. The event became known in Catholic history as the discovery of the hidden Christians. It was, and remains, one of the most extraordinary stories in the 2,000-year history of the Church, a community of faith that had survived the most sustained and systematic religious persecution in modern history, at the price of terrible suffering and countless martyrdoms, to emerge, in a small chapel in Nagasaki Harbor, on a spring afternoon in 1865. Still speaking prayers their great-great-great-grandparents had memorized in the 17th century. Over the next 60 years, the hidden Christians of the Urakami Valley emerged fully into the light. Under the Meiji Restoration's Constitution of 1000, 889, freedom of religion was finally guaranteed in Japan. The persecution ended. The community rebuilt. Between 1895 and 1925, the hidden Christians of Urakami built, largely with their own hands and largely with money raised among their own poor rice farming families, the largest cathedral in East Asia. St. Mary's Cathedral at Urakami, twin towers of red brick, a nave that could hold 6,000 worshippers. Consecrated in the year 1925, 400 years after Francis Xavier had first landed at Kagoshima. By the year 1945, the Catholic community of Nagasaki numbered approximately 12,000 baptized members, all of them descendants of the hidden Christians. This represented, in St. Maximilian Kolbe's estimate from the 1930s, when Kolbe had ministered in Nagasaki before his return to Poland and his own martyrdom at Auschwitz, roughly 60% of all Catholics in Japan. The Urakami district, on the northern edge of Nagasaki, was the heart of that community. Its Nassau streets ran up a small hillside valley, from the industrial Mitsubishi Ordnance Works at the valley floor to the twin towers of the cathedral at the crest. Its people were poor, hard-working, unusually devout, and, in the words of many subscriptions, quietly proud of a heritage that had cost their ancestors so much to preserve. On the morning of August 9, 1945, at 8 o'clock, Father Saburo Nishida, the parish priest of Urakami Cathedral, unlocked the great wooden doors of the cathedral to prepare for the morning's confessions. The Feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary was 6 days away, on the 15th of August, and the parish was preparing for it in the traditional Catholic manner, by making a good confession beforehand. Father Nishida expected an unusually large number of confessions that morning. He had asked another priest, his assistant Father Tamaya, to come in early to help him hear them. By 10 o'clock in the morning, there were approximately 30 Catholics, kneeling in the pews of Urakami Cathedral, waiting their turn at the confessional booths on either side of the nave. They had 1 hour and 2 minutes left to live. To understand why they had 1 hour and 2 minutes left, we have to go back into the sky above Kyushu. We have to follow Bockscar to Kokura and then to Nagasaki. And we have to describe, in order, the remaining 7 of the 9 mistakes. Bockscar and the great artisti, having waited far past their assigned time at the Yakushima rendezvous for the big stink that would never arrive, turned north at approximately 9:40 in the morning of August 9th, 1945, and flew toward the primary target. The distance from Yakushima to Kokura was approximately 280 miles. At the aircraft's cruising speed with a full bomb load, the flight would take about an hour. Bockscar arrived over Kokura at approximately 10:44 in the morning, almost exactly an hour and a half behind the mission timeline that had been laid out at the pre-flight briefing the night before. The city beneath them was invisible. The weather report from Enola Gay, transmitted an hour and a quarter earlier, had promised 3/10 cloud cover. The actual condition, when Bockscar reached the target area, was 7/10 cloud cover, or worse. This was mistake number 3. And it was a mistake of nature, or rather, a mistake of the American bombing schedule of the previous 24 hours. The overnight incendiary raid on Yawata, 6 miles west of Kokura, had produced a heavy smoke pall that had drifted east over the Kokura Arsenal region during the pre-dawn hours. What had been 3/10 cloud cover at 7 in the morning had become opaque haze at 10:40. Sweeney and Bach and Ashworth conferred by radio. The mission orders were absolutely explicit on this point. The atomic weapon was to be dropped only under visual bombing conditions. The Norden bomb site required Beahan to physically see and identify the target through the optics of the site. Radar bombing was expressly prohibited. This restriction had been imposed on the Manhattan Project by the combined chiefs of staff themselves. There was concern that a bomb of this magnitude, dropped by radar under poor visibility, might miss even a large city entirely and hit an area of scattered rural spiral population, producing worse casualties than a targeted urban strike would have caused. Ashworth, as weaponeer, made the decision. They would attempt visual bombing runs. If Beahan could sight the arsenal, they would drop. If he could not, they would proceed to the secondary target at Nagasaki. Bockscar made 3 bomb runs over the Kokura arsenal complex over the next approximately 50 minutes. On the first run, at approximately 10:45, Beahan put his eye to the Norden bomb site and tracked toward the arsenal center point that he had memorized from the reconnaissance photographs. At the release point, he could see only cloud. He called abort. Sweeney banked Bockscar to the south to reset for a second run. The second run began at approximately 11 o'clock. Bockscar approached the arsenal from a slightly different angle. Beahan again put his eye to the site. Again, at the release point, he could see only cloud. He called abort. Sweeney banked again for a third attempt. During the third run, at approximately 11:15, Japanese anti-aircraft fire finally began to reach the aircraft. The gunners at Kokura had by this point identified the American bombers circling above the city and had begun to range their 88mm flak guns on Bockscar's flight path. Beahan again put his eye to the site. He could still see only cloud, punctuated now by black smudges of exploding flak. Sweeney later wrote that the flak bursts were, in his exact phrase, getting a little hairy. Beahan called abort. 3 bomb runs. 0 visual acquisition. Approximately 50 minutes lost over the target area. Bockscar was now running critically low on fuel. The wait at Yakushima had cost her fuel. The 3 bomb runs at high altitude over Kokura had cost her fuel. The failed transfer pump meant that 625 gallons of nominally loaded fuel were forever inaccessible. Ashworth and Sweeney and Kuharek, the flight engineer, conducted an urgent fuel calculation. The answer was grim. Bockscar could not return to her home airfield at Tinian on the fuel remaining. She could not even return to Iwo Jima, the intermediate refueling stop planned for the mission's return leg. Her only option after the bomb was dropped was an emergency landing at the American Forward Airfield at Yanton on the island of Okinawa, roughly 340 miles south of Nagasaki, and she could only reach Okinawa if she flew straight there immediately after the drop, without any additional maneuvering. The decision was made. Ashworth ordered Sweeney to break off from Kokura and proceed to the secondary target at Nagasaki. Sweeney banked Bockscar southwest at approximately 11:20 in the morning of August 9th, 1945. The people of Kokura, sitting under their overcast sky and drinking their morning tea and going to their factory shifts, never knew, that morning or for the rest of that day, how close they had come to dying. They would not learn what had almost happened to them until the American occupation of Japan began the following month, and captured 509th Composite Group mission reports were made public. The Japanese have a phrase for what happened at Kokura: Kokura no kon, the luck of Kokura. It has entered the Japanese language as a proverb for any narrow escape from disaster. For the 250,000 people of Nagasaki, 100 miles to the south, the luck of Kokura was about to be the 9th of 9 mistakes, and the last one. Bockscar covered the distance from Kokura to Nagasaki in approximately 20 minutes. The aircraft arrived over Nagasaki at approximately 11:40 in the morning. The fuel situation was now so critical that Ashworth was preparing to authorize a radar bomb release, in direct violation of the Manhattan Project's visual bombing requirement, in order to release the weapon somewhere over the target area before Bockscar ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the sea with the bomb still on board. Nagasaki, too, was under heavy cloud cover, 7/10 to 8/10. Beahan reported he could not see the aim point, which had been designated as the industrial harbor south of the city center. where the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries shipyards clustered along the deep water port. Ashworth gave the order, "Radar drop." Sweeney concurred. The radar operator, Staff Sergeant Ed Buckley, began to feed the coordinates for the primary aim point to Beahan's release mechanism. The bomb would be dropped by radar, in violation of orders, in approximately 90 seconds. And then, at the last possible moment, at approximately 11:01 and 30 seconds in the morning of August 9th, 1945, 3 miles above the northern edge of the city of Nagasaki, Kermit Beahan saw a hole in the clouds, he said. In his own words from a 1985 interview, "I saw a hole in the clouds, and I could see the stadium below. I said, 'I've got it.' I told the pilot I've got it. He gave me the clear. The stadium Beahan saw was not the aim point. The aim point was more than 2 miles to the south, in the Industrial Harbor District. The stadium was in the Urakami District, at the northern end of the city, where the Mitsubishi Ordnance Works stood on the valley floor, and the twin brick towers of St. Mary's Cathedral stood at the crest of the hill." Beahan did not know this. Beahan had been briefed on general target coordinates. He had not been given a specific list of neighborhoods to avoid. He had a hole in the clouds. He had a visible reference point on the ground. He had roughly 90 seconds of fuel margin remaining. He made the decision that his years of training and his 30 combat missions and his professional judgment as the best bombardier in the 20th Air Force told him to make. He synchronized the Norden bomb sight on the stadium. He released the bomb. The time was 1 minute and 37 seconds past 11 in the morning, local Japan time. Fat Man fell for approximately 43 seconds, dropping through the cloud layer, accelerating toward the Earth, at an altitude of 1,540 feet above the Urakami Valley, at approximately 2 minutes past 11 in the morning of August 9th, 1945. The plutonium implosion mechanism detonated. 21,000 tons of TNT equivalent energy were released in approximately 1 microsecond, 100 yards above the roofs of the industrial neighborhood in which the descendants of the hidden Christians of Japan lived and worked and worshipped. The hypocenter of the explosion, when it was later surveyed by Japanese and American scientific teams, was determined to have been 500 meters northwest of St. Mary's Cathedral of Urakami. Inside the cathedral at the moment of detonation, Father Saburo Nishida was hearing the confession of a member of his parish. The other confessional booth, on the opposite side of the nave, was occupied by his assistant father, Tamaya, who was hearing another confession. Approximately 30 parishioners were kneeling in the pews of the nave, waiting their turn. All of them were killed instantly. The cathedral itself, which had taken 30 years for the hidden Christian community to build, was reduced to rubble in less than a second. The twin brick towers collapsed. The interior burned. The great wooden crucifix above the altar was carbonized. In the surrounding blocks of the Urakami district, approximately 8,500 baptized Catholics were killed instantly by the blast, the heat, and the collapse of the wooden and paper houses in which they lived. Another 2,000 or so would die of radiation sickness and injuries over the following days and weeks. 2/3 of the Catholic population of Nagasaki, roughly half of all the Catholics in Japan, killed in a single second by an American aircraft flown by a devout Irish Catholic pilot from Lowell, Massachusetts, and bombed by a bombardier from a small mining town in Missouri who had gone to college on a football scholarship at Rice Institute in Texas and had spent the previous 3 years of his life dropping ordnance on European cities in the name of the country his ancestors had helped to build, a country founded on the principle of religious freedom. The bomb had missed its intended aim point by 2.5 kilometers. That single miss saved the rest of Nagasaki. The narrow hills of the Urakami Valley confined most of the atomic blast to the industrial and residential district around the cathedral. 60% of Nagasaki was destroyed. If the bomb had hit its intended aim point in the harbor district, closer to the geographic center of the city, the destruction would have been closer to the 90% leveling that had befallen Hiroshima 3 days earlier. That is not a moral defense of what happened. That is a description of physics. The hills of Urakami absorbed the blast that would otherwise have killed tens of thousands more people, and the hills of Urakami absorbed it by killing, first, the hidden Christian community that had spent 250 years of secret and courageous faith to survive into the 20th century in order to build the cathedral that was, in the second above the ground when Fat Man detonated, the closest large structure to the hypocenter. There is no way to describe this coincidence, or this alignment, or this outcome. That does not make the reader feel that some kind of terrible cosmic mistake has taken place. Christians of every denomination and every century have written about this event in the past 80 years, and none of them have satisfactorily accounted for it. And this program will not pretend to account for it either. We will describe what happened. That is what a story does. Dr. Takashi Nagai, 37 years old, a professor of radiology at Nagasaki Medical College Hospital, and a Catholic convert who had been baptized at Urakami Cathedral on the 12th of June, 1934, after reading Blaise Pascal's Pensées, and who had taken the baptismal name Paul in honor of the 16th century Nagasaki martyr Saint Paul Miki, crucified on Nishizaka Hill in 1597, was at his desk in the University Hospital on the north side of the Urakami Valley when the bomb detonated 700 meters from his window. Nagai had been born in the year 1908 in Matsue, on the Sea of Japan coast north of Hiroshima. He had trained as a physician at Nagasaki Medical College in the 1920s and had specialized in the new field of diagnostic radiology. He had married in August of 1934, 2 months after his baptism, a woman named Midori Moriyama, whose family were direct hereditary descendants of the hidden Christian headmen of the Urakami district, and it had been through her family and through his own reading of Pascal that he had converted to Catholicism. Nagai and Midori had had 4 children by the summer of 1945. 2 daughters, Ikuko and Sasano, had died in infancy in the late 1930s, before the war. The 2 who survived were the son Makoto, 10 years old, and the daughter Kayano, 4 years old. The children had been evacuated a month earlier, under the Japanese wartime children's evacuation program called Gakudo Sokai, to Nagai's mother-in-law's farmhouse, in a mountain village called Koba, 5 miles east of Nagasaki. Midori Nagai had chosen to stay behind in the family home in Urakami. She had told her husband, on the morning of August 9th, that she would go to Urakami Cathedral that day for confession. She had left the house at approximately 10:30 in the morning to walk the half-mile up the hill to the cathedral. She had reached the neighborhood surrounding the cathedral when the bomb detonated. Nagai himself was severely injured. He suffered a deep laceration on the right side of his head that severed his temporal artery, and he lost blood catastrophically before a colleague managed to tie off the artery with surgical thread from an emergency medical kit. He was in acute radiation exposure and would develop leukemia within 2 years. He survived the initial injuries. He spent the afternoon and evening of the 9th working with the surviving medical staff of the hospital to treat the wounded who staggered up the hill from the destroyed neighborhoods below. He treated hundreds of patients. He knew, all afternoon, that his wife was somewhere in those neighborhoods. He did not go to look for her until the next morning. He walked down the hill on the 10th of August, 1945, through streets that were no longer streets. The houses of Urakami had been made of wood and paper. They had burned. Everywhere he walked, there were bodies burned beyond recognition and pieces of what had been human beings, mixed with pieces of what had been houses and shrines and small family altars. He reached what had been his own home. It was gone. He continued up the hill toward the cathedral. He recognized his neighborhood only by the shape of the ground. He found Midori's body in the ruins of what had been the family kitchen. She had, apparently, walked back to the house after the initial detonation, perhaps intending to look for him, and had died there of her injuries or of the fires that had followed. Her body was severely burned. Nagai had trouble identifying her at first. Then he saw her right hand. Her right hand was closed around a small mass of blackened metal, roughly the size of a walnut, fused into a single piece. It was her rosary. She had carried it in her pocket every day of her adult life. She had been holding it, apparently, in her right hand at the moment she died. The heat of the atomic detonation had burned away most of her clothing. It had melted the individual beads and links of her rosary into a single carbonized mass of metal in her palm. It had not, however, destroyed it. Takashi Nagai gathered his wife's remains and her rosary. He carried both back up the hill to what was left of the Urakami Parish Cemetery. He buried her there that afternoon. He kept the rosary. He would keep the rosary until the day of his own death from leukemia on the 1st of May, 1951, at the age of 43, in the small chapel he had built with the royalties from his memoir, The Bells of Nagasaki, on the site of the destroyed Urakami Parish, and which he had named Nyokodo, the hermitage of loving one's neighbor as oneself. The rosary is preserved today in the Nagai Memorial Museum on the grounds of the rebuilt Urakami Cathedral in Nagasaki. You can go and see it if you go to Nagasaki. It is small and black and fused together into a single mass, and it is the object in which a great deal of the moral weight of the 20th century has been condensed. Bockscar, at the moment of the detonation, was banking hard to the southwest at 29,000 feet. Ashworth's shouted instructions in the cockpit still audible in the intercom. Tails to the flash. Tails to the flash. Sweeney executed the escape turn that Tibbets had drilled into him at Wendover. The aircraft rotated so that its tail, rather than its cockpit, faced the point of detonation. The shock wave reached the aircraft approximately 45 seconds after the detonation and hit Bockscar with an impact that Sweeney later described as like being kicked by a mule. A second shock wave, reflected off the ground, hit approximately 30 seconds after the first. The aircraft rocked violently but sustained no structural damage. The mushroom cloud rose behind them. From the Great Artisti, where Sergeant Charles Levy was operating the high-speed cameras that Robert Serber had been kicked off Big Stink for lacking a parachute to operate. The photographs that would appear in every American history textbook of the atomic age were taken. Bockscar, riding on the last of her fuel, turned south for Okinawa. She reached Yontan Airfield at approximately 1 in the afternoon Japanese time. Sweeney had radioed ahead that he was inbound with critical fuel emergency, but the air traffic controllers at Yontan had received so many emergency landings that day from B-29s returning from various raids across Japan that they had not cleared the pattern for Bockscar's arrival. Sweeney could not raise the tower. He circled once. His number 2 engine died on the downwind leg. He ordered his crew to fire every emergency flare on board. The flares went up in an unbroken salvo of red and green from Bockscar's flare gun ports. The tower saw the flares. They cleared the pattern. Sweeney executed a dead stick landing, engines flaring in and out of fuel starvation, and touched down hard at the far end of the runway with his flaps only partially deployed. Bockscar rolled to a stop with, by Kuharik's later measurement, approximately 7 gallons of usable fuel remaining in her tanks. The crew climbed out of the aircraft on the tarmac at Yontan. They were greeted by ground personnel who had not been told what they had just done. Ashworth, the senior officer on the mission, walked to the nearest telephone and placed the call to General Curtis LeMay on Guam that would inform LeMay of the results of the second atomic mission. Sweeney sat down on the tarmac with his back against Bockscar's nose wheel, and, according to 2 members of his crew who later described the scene, wept quietly for approximately 20 minutes without saying anything to anyone. The news of the surrender of Nazi Germany 4 months earlier had reached the American public through official communications and radio broadcasts. So on the 8th of May, 1945, the news of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki and of the Emperor Hirohito's decision 6 days later to accept the terms of unconditional surrender laid out at the Potsdam Conference in late July reached the American public over the course of the following week. On the 9th of August, the day of the bombing, the Japanese cabinet met in emergency session in Tokyo. The cabinet was deadlocked 3-3. 3 members, including Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, favored immediate acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration on condition only that the imperial institution be preserved. 3 members, including War Minister General Korochika Anami, favored continued resistance and demanded 4 additional conditions, including a Japanese-conducted war crimes trials and no Allied occupation. The cabinet could not resolve the deadlock. At approximately 2 in the morning on the 10th of August, the cabinet appealed to Emperor Hirohito to break the tie. This was an unprecedented act. In the Japanese Constitutional Order of 1889, the emperor did not directly rule. He reigned. He did not vote in cabinet meetings. He did not resolve political disputes. But in this case, with the war rushing toward its terminal crisis, the cabinet had no other authority to turn to. Hirohito, in a cabinet meeting that lasted until 3 in the morning of the 10th, sided with Foreign Minister Togo. He instructed the cabinet to accept the Potsdam terms on condition of preservation of the imperial institution alone. The Japanese offer was transmitted to the Allies on the 10th of August. The Allied response, essentially agreeing to Japanese terms, was transmitted on the 12th. A group of junior Japanese army officers attempted a coup d'état on the night of the 14th to prevent the surrender broadcast from being made. The coup failed. Hirohito's recorded surrender broadcast was played over Japanese national radio at noon on the 15th of August. The war in the Pacific was over. The formal surrender was signed on the deck of the American battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September, 1945. Among the American officers present on the Missouri that morning, standing behind General Douglas MacArthur as MacArthur affixed his signature to the instrument of surrender, was General Walter Kruger of the 6th United States Army. Kruger had commanded the American reduction of the Japanese 16th Army on Luzon over the previous 9 months. He was the same Kruger whose story this program has told previously. He was one of the last Mustang generals of the American Army who had begun his career as a private in Cuba. In 1898, he stood in shadow on the Missouri's deck that morning and watched a Japanese diplomat named Mamoru Shigemitsu sign the paper that ended the war he had spent 47 years preparing to fight and only 3.5 years actually fighting. The Nagasaki mission had been the last major combat operation of the Second World War in either theater. Charles Sweeney returned to the United States in October of 1945. He was assigned to the Air Force Reserve Component in Massachusetts. He rose over the following 2 decades to the rank of Major General in the Massachusetts Air National Guard, from which he retired in 1976. He wrote his memoir War's End in 1997 with the assistance of a co-author. He never publicly expressed regret for the Nagasaki mission. He appeared occasionally on American television history documentaries in the 1990s and early 2000s to describe the mission from the perspective of the pilot who had flown it. He died on the 16th of July, 2004, in Boston at the age of 84, of complications following a stroke. He was buried at Milton Cemetery in Milton, Massachusetts, in the Catholic section, with a plain military headstone that gives his name and his dates and his rank. Kermit Beahan returned to the United States on the same aircraft and lived in various Air Force assignments throughout the 1940s and 1950s. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1964. He settled in the Clear Lake area of Houston, Texas, and worked as a technical writer for the Brown and Root engineering firm through the mid-1980s. He spoke publicly about the Nagasaki mission only rarely. In a 1985 interview with Air Force magazine on the 40th anniversary of the bombing, Beahan said, "The bombing had been the best way out of a hell of a mess." He said he had never received a single letter from a Japanese person accusing him of any wrongdoing. He said that on a visit to Japan in the 1970s, he had met a group of 25 Japanese men and women who had thanked him for helping to end the war. He also said, in that same interview, "I hope that I remain the last man to have ever dropped an atomic bomb on another human being." He died in Houston on the 9th of March, 1989, of a heart attack at the age of 70. He was buried at Houston National Cemetery. His grave is in Section K, Site 389. If you visit Houston National Cemetery, you can find it. His widow Tess and his family placed on his headstone the inscription, "The great artiste, Frederick Ashworth, rose to Vice Admiral of the United States Navy and retired in 1968 after a distinguished career in the American nuclear submarine program under Admiral Hyman Rickover." He died in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on the 3rd of December, 2005, at the age of 93. He never publicly discussed the moment on Bockscar when he had effectively authorized Sweeney to violate the visual bombing requirement by preparing a radar drop before the hole in the clouds appeared. Robert Serber, the physicist who had been kicked off Big Stink for lacking a parachute, returned to the United States and continued his physics career at Columbia University in New York. He became one of the earliest and most vocal Manhattan Project scientists to publicly oppose the further development and stockpiling of nuclear weapons. He served as a scientific advisor to the Baruch Plan for International Nuclear Control in 1946 and to the Federation of American Scientists throughout the 1950s and 1960s. He wrote a technical primer on nuclear weapons physics called the Los Alamos Primer that remains a foundational document in the public understanding of the American atomic program. He died in New York on the 1st of June, 1997, at the age of 88 of natural causes. Major James Hopkins, whose miscalculation of the Yakushima rendezvous altitude had cost the mission 30 minutes of fuel and had contributed to the chain of events that placed the bomb over Urakami, remained in the post-war Air Force but did not have a distinguished later career. He retired at his commissioned rank of lieutenant colonel in the middle 1960s. He died in 1993. He never publicly discussed the Big Stink altitude error. Takashi Nagai wrote The Bells of Nagasaki in Japanese under the title Nagasaki no Kane from his sickbed in the small chapel called Nyokodo that he had built with the royalties from his earlier medical writings. The book was completed in 1946 and delayed by the American occupation censorship regime until 1949, when it was finally published and became an immediate national sensation in Japan. It sold over 100,000 copies in its first year. It was translated into English in 1951 and into a dozen other languages over the following decade. A Japanese film based on the book was released in 1950 to enormous popular acclaim. Nagai's central theological interpretation of the bombing, that the hidden Christian community of Urakami had been a burnt offering on the altar of world peace, has been much disputed by later Catholic theologians. Nagai's argument, delivered in a famous funeral address at the ruins of the cathedral in November of 1945, was that the atomic destruction of the most Christian community in Japan had provided the moral shock that persuaded the emperor to accept unconditional surrender and had thus ended the war. Nagai argued that the Urakami dead should be regarded in Catholic sacramental terms as a hansai, a burnt offering that had brought about the peace. Later theologians, including the Nagasaki-born writer Shusaku Endo in his novel Silence, have argued that Nagai's interpretation risks glorifying the suffering of the innocent in a way that Catholic tradition does not, in fact, permit. The argument continues. Nagai himself died of the leukemia he had contracted from his radiation exposure on the 1st of May, 1951, at Nyokoto. He was 43 years old. His two surviving children, Makoto and Kayano, who had been evacuated to their grandmother's farms in Koba a month before the bombing, both lived long lives. Makoto Nagai became a physician like his father and lived until the year 2001, when he died at the age of 66. Kayano Nagai became a writer who preserved and edited her father's papers and lived until the year 2008, when she died at the age of 67. Their two older sisters, Ikuko and Sasano, had died in infancy in the late 1930s before the war. The Nagai family line, through Makoto and Kayano's children and grandchildren, continues in Nagasaki today. The Urakami Cathedral was rebuilt on the same site over the years from 1955 to 1959, using largely the same rose-colored brick as the original and preserving the twin tower silhouette. In front of the new cathedral, on a low pedestal, sits the salvaged head of the original wooden statue of the Virgin Mary that had stood above the main altar of the destroyed cathedral. The head was recovered from the ruins several weeks after the bombing. It is scorched black. Its eyes are gone. Its features are barely recognizable as human, and only barely recognizable as the Virgin Mary. The statue is called in Japanese the Hibaku no Maria, the bombed Virgin. In November of 2019, Pope Francis visited Nagasaki, the second pope to do so, after John Paul II in 1981. He delivered a speech on the site of the destroyed cathedral, in the rain, in the presence of survivors, and of the bombed Virgin. He called for the total abolition of nuclear weapons. He said, "With the plain moral force that only a pope speaking in Nagasaki could achieve, the use of atomic energy for purposes of war is immoral, as is the possession of atomic weapons." Standing behind Pope Francis on the platform that afternoon, holding a small piece of white cloth to shield his aging head from the rain, was Archbishop Mitsuaki Takami of Nagasaki. Takami had been born in the year 1946. His mother had been pregnant with him. In the early weeks of her pregnancy, on the morning the bomb had fallen, she had been exposed to significant residual radiation. Takami had been born with health problems related to that exposure, and he had lived his entire life, as in his own phrase, a Hibaku Nisei, a second-generation atomic bomb survivor. His mother had been a descendant, on her mother's side, of the hidden Christian headmen of the Urakami Valley. Her ancestors had trampled the Fumiyi every January for 250 years, secretly weeping, secretly praying, secretly preserving the faith. Takami's own family lineage as a Catholic ran unbroken in Nagasaki, back to the reign of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the 16th century. Takami became a priest in 1972. He rose through the Japanese church hierarchy. He was consecrated Archbishop of Nagasaki in 2003. He served as Archbishop until his retirement in 2022. He travels the world in his retirement, carrying with him the small statue of the Virgin Mary that his family has preserved through the generations of the hidden Christian era, and speaking against the continued existence of nuclear weapons in the arsenals of the world's nations. He is alive as this program is being made. He is in his late 70s. He is the living link between the hidden Christians of the 16th century and the men and women of the 21st. If you go to Nagasaki, And if you attend the annual Peace Memorial Ceremony that is held every year at the Hypocenter on the 9th of August at 11:02 in the morning, the exact minute of the detonation, you may see Archbishop Takami in the front row of the survivors. You will not be able to pick him out of a crowd. He is a small elderly Japanese man in the robes of a Catholic archbishop. He will stand for the moment of silence. He will bow his head. He will pray in Japanese and in Latin. He will carry, in that moment, in his person and in his ancestry, the 400-year story of the hidden Christians of Japan and the 80-year story of the second atomic bomb, and the questions that neither story has ever been able to fully answer. We come now to the end. There is no clean moral answer to what happened at Nagasaki on the morning of August 9th, 1945. Historians have argued the question for 80 years. They will argue it for another 80. Did the second bomb, following on the first, actually convince the Japanese cabinet to accept surrender, when otherwise they might have continued to fight? Or did the cabinet already understand, after Hiroshima on the 6th, and after the Soviet declaration of war on the 8th, that the war was lost, and would have accepted surrender within days, regardless of what Bockscar did or did not do that morning? Did the bomb save 500,000 American lives, as President Truman later maintained, by preventing an amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands that would have cost enormous casualties on both sides? Or would a naval blockade and continued conventional bombing have brought Japan to surrender within months at a much lower cost in Japanese civilian lives? Was the mission necessary? Was it just? Was it moral? This program will not answer these questions. Better minds than ours have tried, and none of them have satisfied themselves. And this program will not pretend to have found what they failed to find. What this program can do is remember the 12,000 baptized Catholics of Urakami who were the descendants of the hidden Christians of Japan, 8,500 of whom died that morning. 2 priests, Father Saburo Nishida and Father Tamaya, hearing confessions when the roof came down on them. 30 parishioners kneeling in the pews. Midori Nagai walking up the hill toward the cathedral with her rosary in her pocket. 250 years of secret faith. 400 years of martyrdom. 10 generations of trampling the Fumi every January and going home to weep. All of it culminating in a single second on a Thursday morning in August of 1945. Remember Dr. Takashi Nagai, who found his wife's rosary melted into a single black mass of metal in her burned right hand, and who spent the 6 years of life he had left writing the bells of Nagasaki from a chapel he built out of the ruins. Remember Archbishop Mitsuaki Takami, still alive as this program is made, still speaking, still praying, still carrying the small statue of the Virgin his family kept hidden for 10 generations. And remember the men in the airplane. Remember Major Charles Sweeney, 25 years old, an Irish Catholic boy from a mill town in Massachusetts, who made the operational decisions that put the bomb over Urakami. He carried those decisions in his head for 59 more years, and then he died and was buried in a Catholic cemetery in a small town near Boston. Remember Kermit Beahan, born on the 9th of August, 1918, in Joplin, Missouri, and who dropped the bomb on his 27th birthday. He carried that decision in his head for 44 years, and then he died of a heart attack in Houston and was buried in the Veterans Cemetery there, with a headstone that read, "The Great Artisti." Remember Robert Serber, kicked off Big Stink for a missing parachute, who spent the rest of his life advocating against the weapons he had helped design. Remember Major James Hopkins, who went to the wrong altitude and never spoke publicly about it for the remaining 48 years of his life. Remember them all, on all sides, because they were all there, all present in the same terrible morning. And they were all men and women and children with names and families and stories that ran forward and backward through the long history of the century. The bomb missed its aim point by 2.5 kilometers. That was not a moral judgment. That was wind and mathematics and the last second appearance of a hole in the clouds over the Urakami district. But because of that miss, the second atomic weapon used in human history landed not over an arsenal, or a shipyard, or a military headquarters, but over a valley of Christian believers who had done nothing to any American and who had themselves survived the most brutal religious persecution in the modern history of the world. In order to keep, into the 20th century, the faith that they were, at 11 o'clock in the morning of August 9th, 1945, preparing to celebrate. There is no clean moral answer. There is only what happened, and the responsibility of those of us who come after to remember that it happened. May we remember the 12,000 of Urakami. May we remember the men in the airplane. May we remember Father Nishida in the confessional, and Midori Nagai on the hill, and Archbishop Takami still walking among us. May we remember the question that 80 years has not answered. May we be worthy of the memory. Thank you for listening. If you have watched our previous programs on the end of the Second World War, on Walter Kruger, standing behind Douglas MacArthur on the deck of the Missouri, on the men of the 30th Infantry Division in the ruined grocery stores of the Ruhr Valley, on the two Mustang generals whose signatures at Rheims and on Luzon closed the European War, this is where those stories end. On the morning of the 9th of August, 1945, 337 days after D-Day, 137 days after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, 6 days before the surrender of Japan, 24 days before the ceremony on the deck of the Missouri at 11:02 in the morning of a Thursday, over a small valley in the northern part of a port city on the western coast of Kyushu, where 12,000 baptized Catholics, the descendants of the hidden Christians of Japan, had built the largest cathedral in Asia over the ruins of 250 years of secret and unbroken faith. The story of the 20th century, in some real way, ends there. We do not have to like where it ends. We do not have to defend it. We do not have to explain it away. We only have to remember it, and to try, in whatever moments we are given in our own lives, to make of ourselves the kind of men and women who would not have, on our own consciences, the memory of 11:02 on the morning of the 9th of August, in the year 1945. Thank you. Good night, and God have mercy on us all.